It's the week ending Friday the 20th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Israel and Iran exchanging missile and drone strikes, Donald Trump leaving the G7 summit in Canada early, and the death of How Clean Is Your House TV personality Kim Woodburn at the age of 83. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me each week from the Week's digital team is Jamie Timson and Harriet Marsden, and from the Week Junior, senior editor Felicity Capon. And in memory of 90s TV pundit Kim Woodburn, a question for you all. How clean is your house?
Oh my God, not clean at all.
Well, my house is spotless.
I would go more on the not clean side than the clean, although we do try.
This is really bad, I know, I'm sorry, but I had never heard of this woman before this week, and now I've become obsessed with her. I'm reading absolutely everything there is to read about her. I'm watching all of these clips. It's been such a revelation.
Let's kick off the news with Jamie. You're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we found out it's not easy being green.
We need to turn this around because slot machines in these buildings are some of the most dangerous and addictive forms of gambling. They are destroying people's lives, and it is time to legislate against it.
Deputy leader of the Green Party, Zach Polanski, taking aim at gambling shops on Instagram on Tuesday. But Jamie, the story isn't gambling shops. Your story is him.
Is Zach Polanski himself.
Yeah.
He's been absolutely everywhere this week, Ollie. There was an interview in The Big Issue. He was on the Jeremy Vine show. Well, he's had loads of interviews across The Independent, The Guardian, The New Statesman. He's appeared on Politics Joe, Novara Media, everywhere, the kind of cultural left, I would say.
Yes, I was going to say, that's the through line of all those titles, isn't it? So why? He's on manoeuvres.
The next leader of the Green Party will be announced on the 2nd of September. It was kind of assumed that it would be the so-called establishment choice, which is Adrian Ramsey and Ellie Chowns. But Zach Polanski, who we just heard there, has thrown his hat into the ring. His brand of politics, he defines as eco-populism for the left. His main argument really is that reform has kind of taken over the media with the rise of the kind of populist right. But there is space in the political firmament for the kind of populist left argument. I think he sees the Green Party as often kind of characterised as one issue, but actually as well as climate change, which obviously without a kind of an earth, everything else is immaterial, as he would say. There is also a point that actually a lot of what the Green Party could stand for is a kind of anti-oligarchy, anti-wealth, like huge amounts of wealth, and trying to show that there isn't so much us versus them of working class, middle class, and actually an us versus them of, you know, everyone and the 1%.
Harriet, wasn't this tried before and it was called Corbynism?
I think what people might be surprised to find out if they're not engaging a lot with reform's agenda is that that party is actually quite far to the left on certain issues, further than the typical British voter. They support public ownership of the water and rail industries, and they think foreign ownership of British firms is bad for the country, and that big companies don't pay enough tax. So they're kind of pro-worker and pro-nationalisation. So in that sense, yes, there are certain elements of Zach Polanski's eco-populism that you could see on the Corbynista left circles, but also you can see in reform voter circles too.
Felicity, I mean, all of this sort of suggests that the Green Party's failing in some way, that they need a new leader, that they need to be rethought. But they've got more MPs than they've ever had before. I mean, albeit that's only 4 people, but still, they are seen as being a success story, aren't they?
Yeah, and they sort of are, really. The figures do bear that out. In the 2024 general election, they got the best results the party has ever had, with almost 2 million votes. And they made a net gain in May, and increasing their number of councillors to 859 in 181 councils. This is something that they've sort of complained about, is that reform is actually grabbing all the headlines, but actually the general trajectory of the Greens is quite good, and they are steadily increasing in popularity and increasing in numbers. Now, who those new Green voters are is a really interesting question, because are they disaffected Labour voters who are fed up with Keir Starmer and lots of promises that he's broken, or his stance on Gaza, or his U-turns on the winter fuel payments, whatever it is it disaffected Labour voters moving further to the left in the same way that you're seeing Conservatives moving further to the right? Or is it that climate change, as one of the biggest existential threats to us, is actually moving up the agenda in people's minds, and so therefore they're voting, seeing the Green Party as a popular party? But the problem with the Greens, what they've always had really, and I don't really see any signs of them shrugging this off, is that they've always lacked credibility. They are a not serious party connected to the biggest, one of the most serious issues that we have going. And I think they've always had that problem, and I think partly because on their main message of the environment they are anti-nuclear, and for me that just doesn't tally. I can't see how you could be the Green Party and be anti-nuclear. And also the other issue is net zero. They are obviously pro net zero. They want to move faster on net zero than the other parties, and for many voters that is also a problem.
It's interesting, Jamie, isn't it? That analysis of them being a not serious party attached to a serious issue. You could very much say the same thing about reform, couldn't you? They are a not serious party led by a hugely charismatic and popular figure about one important issue, which is immigration. Everything else is a bit weird. So that's working for them. Could that work for the Greens anyway?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what the kind of role of Zach Polanski, or what he's aiming for, is to kind of mimic the, as he says, their four MPs are, one is a scientist, one's an engineer, one's a renewables expert, and one is a former MEP. None of them are really storytellers. Like, none of them are really very good at putting the message across on public platforms. He is a former actor. He's also a former hypnotherapist, which often comes up when you talk about him. And he was involved in a Sun newspaper interview where a woman went to see him to basically be hypnotized into believing that her breasts were bigger. But the point about bringing that up, because it does always get brought up when people talk about Zach Polanski, is that quite often people who have had previous jobs, or ordinary people, quote unquote ordinary people, are often discredited quite quickly for something that they've done in their past life. And it kind of proves that he's getting big enough and bigger because people are trying to take him down for something that he did quite a long time ago.
I think that was a Sun reporter, wasn't it? It was a sting by the Sun.
Yeah, so she went in undercover.
Yeah.
And it was a service that he was apparently providing, and she suggested she wanted.
Yes, exactly. He was working in punch drunk type theatre at the time, community theatre. I have a kind of sympathy for his argument. I think Felicity makes a good point about the fact that they struggle to have a kind of coherent message. I think the net zero thing is really important because, and one of the things that he says is that net zero seems to have been foisted on the working class, and the argument is that the working class cannot afford net zero, and therefore we kind of shouldn't go as quickly or as fast. But his argument is that actually the people that could afford it are potentially the ones that have caused the most issues.
But what do you mean by foisted on the working class? You mean because everyone's taxes have to go up to pay for it?
Yeah.
Well, this was Carla Denier's argument. So she is the current co-leader of the Green Party.
So she's what you won't run into the name, but she's the only one you see on the telly. So if you're thinking which Green MP is that one, it's the one with the short hair that pops up on the news.
Yeah, I mean, this is also part of the problem in that I don't believe that the average person could name either co-leader of the Green Party or Zach Polanski, who's the deputy leader. No. So that is a problem. I still jump
to the former leader. What was her name? I can't remember her name.
Caroline Lucas.
Yeah, I do too.
She's the one you think of still. And weirdly, like Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, like he talks more about Green Party issues than the actual Green Party.
Or you remember Natalie Bennett in 2015 who had that horrendous car crash interview which still lingers.
God, I do remember that. But Carla Denier's argument, and she knows what she's talking about because before she got into politics, she was actually a renewable energy engineer. And she argued, when she said that she was going to step down from the leadership contest, she argued that Labour has allowed climate action. They've allowed the narrative is that climate action has kind of become associated with like closed factories and hardship for the working classes and decline for deprived areas. And she's saying that actually the reality is that the oil and gas giants have exploited the workers and poisoned the environment and extracted maximum profits and then taken them offshore. And now that the industry is dying, they're cutting their losses and laying off workers and hollowing out communities. So this is very similar to the argument that is actually being made in some parts of the left that we were discussing, that's now like the left that I guess the current Labour leadership has sort of lost or abandoned, depending on which way you look at it. But Zach Polanski's stance on net zero is that he supports it, but not if poor people have to pay for it or suffer. But that's not only, I think, is that a lot of people would describe that as quite intellectually weak and disingenuous, but it's also like a classic left of centre position. It's not anything radically new or even like particularly that populist. And then you've got Nigel Farage, who I know you said that he's made immigration his main battleground, but he has also made climate policy a big battleground. He's exploiting the fact that Labour has allowed the narrative to become that climate action basically equals hardship. So I guess it's like logical that Polanski would be trying to meet him there. But if you are angry about net zero, you wouldn't vote for the Green Party. It's not a battle that Polanski can ever win. If you're angry about net zero and climate action, you definitely don't vote Green.
Also, I wonder what happened to those Green Tories, Felicity. I mean, it was recent memory, David Cameron changing the logo of the Conservative Party to a tree.
And the Huskies.
Yes, they were the party of the environment.
Yeah, exactly.
He did. There was obviously a gap there. I mean, okay, better economic times. What do you do if you're someone who would have voted Conservative but cares about the environment? Because Badenoch's Conservatives and Reform are moving away from the net zero stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be part of the reason why the Greens are picking up votes, because they just see the Green Party as pro-environment. I think your point about David Cameron sort of rebranding the Tories as Green was really interesting, because for a while it did seem that was such a big concern that politics was starting to reflect that. And, you had Theresa May. She was one of the first ones to pledge net zero by 2050, I think. You had eco-warriors like Greta Thunberg, who suddenly become, hugely popular, revered figures, which makes me wonder if, more people are just becoming interested in climate change as an issue. I think the Tories, the idea of a two-party political system is now dead. It's no longer about Labour and Tories. I wonder whether it's about more accentuated polarisation, that if you're left, you're going to go further to the left, Labour's going to Green, and if you're right, you're going further to Reform. And that's really interesting that there's, these alternative parties that you could vote for. The problem with the Greens, not only the point about them lacking credibility, they never seem to have costed any of their plans. There seems to be this endless well of money that they would throw at things.
Although Reform hasn't either, to be fair.
True.
I think it is a classic case of the left being held to a higher standard than the right. And I think we have to be careful if, in any sense, when you're looking across politics, of being like, okay, particularly in the media, the right is kind of given sometimes a platform to be able to say how they feel and dominate, and the left is being asked kind of much more intense questions about costings. And that to me is the worry, is that in the end the left kind of eats itself by saying you're not pure enough in your ideology, whereas the right is able to just kind of ride roughshod.
It's also eating itself over the trans issue, which seems to have really come to divide the Green Party, and I honestly don't know why, for a party that seems to be, by its name about saving the planet and the environment, that they have got so caught up in the trans issue. And it seems to be like there's divisions. There's now other parties, right? Green parties, which are explicitly for people who follow the science on the trans issue and follow the science on the climate change. And I think Polanski's quite divisive on that. He sort of stood up at various Green conferences and said trans women are women and that sort of thing. And I just don't know why they're eating themselves up over that, because I think that could, the battle for the soul of the Green Party seems to be in some ways about trans issues, which seems to be a massive shame. I think if the Greens were actually about environmentalism and protecting British wildlife, if they focused more on cleaning up the waterways, if they focused on stopping ugly developments, if they thought about protecting farmers and the way farmers have to produce food for us, as well as, keeping wildlife in a good shape, I think they would pick up more voters there. But at the moment, they seem to be a party who is slightly all over the place, and they need to get more credible quickly.
I think the problem with the Green Party has been and always will be that those on the left who feel let down by Labour maybe consider voting for the Green Party, but people who are feeling let down on the left and the right are flocking to Reform. It's a much broader church.
And Jamie, just to look forward to the next general election then, and this is relevant to Reform and to the Green Party actually, people talk about it's the end of the two-party system. Felicity said that. But is it really, given that Labour have a big majority, that when it comes to the next election, ultimately, generally, people are choosing between Labour and the Conservatives, regardless of everything else, including the Liberal Democrats? And so, actually, You know, if you want vaguely left-wing policies, a lot of people are going to be inclined to vote Labour, not Reform, and not Green.
Greens are second to Labour in 39 constituencies, and Polanski's supporters definitely believe that they can overtake. And Polanski has said he'd love to see Greens have between 30 and 50 MPs at the next election. I'm willing to put my hat on the line. Is that a phrase? Doesn't feel like a phrase.
Money on the line?
I'm down with it.
Yeah, that they won't get between 30 and 50 MPs at the next general election. But I probably agree with you, Ollie, for one of the few times. That I think that we're going to see I think we'll see Robert Jenrick lead the Conservatives back towards a kind of two-party system against Keir Starmer.
Funny you should mention him. Up next, what price will people pay to fill the public service gap? That's after this. Okay, Felicity, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think this week will be remembered for the terrible state we're in.
Excuse me, do you think it's all right not to pay? Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay? Do you want to go back and pay like everybody else? Do you think it's all right not to pay? Why don't you go back and pay? You can say off as much as you want.
The now infamous video of Tory MP Robert Jenrick confronting fare dodgers on the London Underground. Felicity, that was a few weeks ago. What's the story this week?
Yeah, it got lots of press attention, Robert Jenrick doing his thing in Stratford, but it is part of a wider trend of people deciding to take matters into their own hand because they no longer feel that public services, whether it's the police or councils, can be relied upon to deliver essential services. And at the same time, this week, in the wake of last week's spending review, the Local Government Association has warned that even with additional 5% increases in tax, about 30 councils in England face a shortfall in funding of more than £8 billion by 2028. So basically, council taxes are going up, services are being reduced or cut entirely or don't exist. And it's raising some fundamentally important questions about our society. What's going wrong? Is this going to produce a two-tier society where the wealthy just start opting out of public services and paying their own way?
Okay, yes, all right, lots there. I mean, before we get on to the sort of morality of a two-tier service, if that is what this leads to, the principle of, you know, your bins aren't being collected, but you can afford for a private company to collect them. Why shouldn't you do that? Why shouldn't you take action yourself?
Well, the bins is a really interesting one. So lots of private bin collections now are going around. There's a Clearer B van in our road, constantly up the road. And that's because many councils, in order to cut costs, they're cutting back on how frequently they collect the rubbish. So you're seeing that in Conway in North Wales and Bristol. I think they're toying with the idea of going down to rubbish collections once a month too. And in this vacuum, opportunists are stepping in and offering a service to pick up people's rubbish. Ironically, that means that councils are having to spend more of their money going after people who are fly tipping. So actually, that's a really big problem. That's what's happening.
Harriet, is it any different to private health insurance? I mean, it's always been the case that if you can afford to supplement what the state provides, then that's an option that's available to you.
That's a really interesting question. My knee-jerk reaction is that it is different. And I'm just trying to figure out why I feel that is the case. I suppose that in terms of the bins being collected, if we just use that as an example.
That is the totemic example, isn't it? Everyone gets very emotional about bins.
It's a basic public sanitation issue. It's not a private issue. It's actually a public community issue because it does affect the community if some bins are being collected by a private company and others are being failed to be collected by the council. It also, I think they pay council tax, and they do expect bin collection to be a kind of fundamental part of what they get out of that, or like national insurance, for example. So I do think that in terms of healthcare, it is different because although, yes, you can pay for private healthcare, you still have access to the National Health Service. Like, you still do not have to pay for private healthcare if you don't want to. Obviously, the NHS is struggling in all sorts of terrible ways, and that's a completely separate and devastating issue for the country. But I do think as a basic level, you can expect in one of the richest, most developed countries in the world where people are paying higher and higher costs to live there, you can expect your rubbish to be taken away by the state because that is a public health issue.
I think it's about transparency, right? That's the kind of bottom line, is that the difference between private and public is that the public is part of the democracy, and there's a loss of an accountability if your public services are being taken up by private services. Like Felicity says, you don't know where they're taking the rubbish, you don't know what they're doing with it. But also, even for things like healthcare, you've got less recourse with a private healthcare system than you do with a public healthcare system. And ultimately, that lack of accountability and lack of transparency is a kind of a symptom of the kind of poor state that the country is in.
I suppose as well, whereas the healthcare system, frankly, for decades has been in a position where we can see it can't cater to everybody. And so people paying privately to be accelerated is not ideal, but actually frees up space for people to get treated on the NHS. In the case of bins, we can all remember a situation 5-10 years ago where everything was working fine. What's happened is councils are struggling, Felicity, and I think a lot of people don't really understand why, or why sanitation isn't actually a government issue and not something that can be delegated to regional areas where, you know, some are good and some are bad. We should all be able to have clean air and hygiene.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest squeezes on council budgets at the moment is social care. And I think there are some projections that councils are getting to a point where actually all they will be able to afford to pay for is social care. And that's partly because of an ageing population. But there's also lots of other pressures on them, housing, immigration. If you listen to Reform, they would say there's a lot of bureaucratic waste that needs cleaning up. And I live in Folkestone. Reform has just taken over Kent County Council, and they're going in with a Doge-esque inquiry to try and root out. And they claim that they found loads and, you know, millions and millions in wasteful expenditure. There's also an issue, which I find really interesting, that the Eye have done quite a lot on, about council top brass pay. So actually you have a lot of the top brass in councils who are getting, you know, easily 6-figure salaries, and they're going up at the same time when they are pleading for council taxes to go up, which is absolutely galling. There's just a huge problem that needs to be fixed here. And part of the thing that I've come back to, which is going to sound probably very idealistic and naive, but in this country, we keep on banging on about how we have absolutely no money. There's no money, and Labour blames all the Tory years for leaving us in the position. We probably need to start thinking about some sort of collaboration between the private and the public spheres. We probably need to think about greater civic responsibility ourselves in terms of, you know, doing more to actually improve our communities ourselves, because the money's not there. And the more we keep on banging, and also when there is money there, you know, we keep on pouring money into the NHS, it doesn't do anything. Croydon Council is an example of a council where they keep on putting in money, taxes keep on going up, it doesn't do anything. So we need to start being more innovative, more creative, having more civic responsibility ourselves if we want to see any change.
But public-private partnership is a thing, Jamie, and has been for years.
Yeah, it hasn't gone very well, I would say. The main problem, though, is the gerontocracy stuff. Is that, like, basically who votes is old people. What do old people care about? Probably social care. Probably, you know, if that's the thing that councils are having to spend a lot of money on in order to keep those people alive, we're living in a society that's only kind of really going one way. And you only have to look at the winter fuel stuff to see that, like, this is a government that is so... They tried to make a decision on this kind of stuff. They tried to make a decision in order to try and save some money in the right areas and put it back in. And they've had to row back on it because these people are the people that are voting. These people are the people that they need to, and it's an aging population as well. So, I mean, it's all tied up with, you know, everything that we've talked about on this podcast loads of times before. I agree that we need to do more as a community. And I think local democracy and local, you know, citizens' assemblies and all of that are the way forward, because that's where power lies, is in local communities. But I also, at some point, a government is going to have to take a big decision about social care and about what to do about paying for an elderly, ageing population, and not be afraid. I mean, I would have thought this government with its huge majority could have done it, but they can't. So
isn't that partly why the assisted dying bill is so worrying, though, is that you have people at the end of their life and all these conversations about how there's such a drain on society. I wonder if that, I mean, I don't want to go off on a massive tangent because that's not what we're talking about, but it does make me feel very...
Preempting the viral video where Robert Jenrick goes around offering to end people's lives.
but to go back to the question of Labour's majority and their fear of tackling A, social care, but B, the issues of a gerontocracy and an ageing population, I do completely agree with Jamie that if there was ever a government that could have done something in this capacity that would have actually saved an incredible amount of money, it would have been a Labour government for the first time in 14 years with a stonking majority. And the fact that they basically just sort of got shook and rolled back on it because they didn't want to take the burn and the outrage, and they didn't like how badly that it was polling.
Well, it was enormously unpopular, that policy, amongst lots of people.
But it's such an indictment. It's such an indictment of how this government is governing. It's governing as though it's going into an election rather than 3 to 4 years worth of an astonishing level of power. But that is kind of another tangent. I do think that in this case, what we're also talking about is a breakdown in trust between citizens and the state institutions that they pay for, that they are meant to be protected by. There is a real breakdown of trust. Like, it's not just that people aren't getting the services that they deserve and pay for, it's that they don't believe that they will as well. I think there is a wider trust issue, which is why we're seeing such a massive rise of private policing firms in recent years. But also, I agree with Jamie that the power really lies in the local community level, and that's from the ground up is the way that communities can improve things and get things done. But I do think that we should be wary of kind of letting this slightly Thatcherite light rhetoric creep in, because it sometimes sounds as though what we're saying when we say that private institutions need to work better with public institutions, it's sounding a little bit, there's no such thing as society light, which I fundamentally disagree with.
But you know what? It doesn't have to come from a political perspective. It can just come purely from a practical perspective, as I was hinting at with my first question to you, Felicity. And part of this story, as Harriet just mentioned, is privately funded police firms. And I've interviewed the MD on my podcast, The Modern Man. I've interviewed the MD of My Local Bobby, which is one of these companies you can get to police your street for money. And he comes at this as an ex-police officer himself in a purely practical sense. I know, he says, that the police will not handle these cases because they're either too small and don't impact enough people, they have too much paperwork, or they can't get the evidence. I can do that for them and hand them a case. And it's just filling a gap that he knows is not being filled by the state anymore.
I think that's definitely one of the examples where it does seem that there is a lot of collaboration between the two, partly because I think My Local Bobby and some of the other companies set up to go after stolen...
Blue Light is another one, isn't it?
Yeah. Some of them, I think they are ex-coppers themselves or ex-army men themselves, and I think they can work quite well together in that way. I think some of the privately hired guys have a lot of sympathies with the pressure that the police force are under. And if they use a tracker or whatever and find all these stolen vehicles and then tell the police about it, that does seem to be working quite well. And with car thefts at the highest level in decades, it just seems like the police have really just, can't tackle that. They have so many other things, especially with the rise of online fraud and more private crimes, crimes that used to be treated as private issues like domestic violence or rape or that sort of thing. The police are just stretched, and I think they probably quite welcome these private companies stepping in to help them out.
But it is, again, this is also a confidence issue because, there was a YouGov survey really recently that found that 50% of adults in Britain had not very much confidence or no confidence at all in their local police force. That's up from 42% in 2019. So it's actually quite a big jump. And that's not really a jump that can be explained by either the rise in online fraud, although of course there has been an enormous rise in online fraud, which the police really aren't set up to tackle. But it can't really be explained by police numbers either, because police numbers, although had been going down since 2009 for years and years and years, have actually sort of ticked up slightly in the last couple of years. It's a trust thing. And I do think, for example, my local police force, which is the Met in London, a report in 2023 found the police force to be institutionally homophobic, racist, and sexist and misogynistic. So in that capacity, what we're also talking about is the failure of the police, not just that there is a success of these private police forces stepping in. Why would I trust the Met?
Jamie, where you are in Glasgow, if the residents in the street that you lived in all clubbed together and said, we can afford to have a private police force outside our homes and it's going to cost an affordable amount, I don't know, £50 a month, would you object to that on moral grounds, or would you find yourself paying up?
Yeah, I would. I kind of balk at the idea of giving people who aren't accountable extra powers, particularly when I've got no idea about what kind of discipline processes they would go through or how they would pick and choose who to arrest. So I wouldn't be a part of it. What I would like to say, to try and maybe end on a bit of a positive note, is that we seem to, as a society, completely forgotten about COVID and the way that people banded together in local communities to provide actual real support for people that wasn't state-led, that was a lot of WhatsApp groups, there was a lot of technology-driven to be able to help people out. And I think in lots and lots and lots of ways, we've forgotten what it was like during COVID. But that's one of the ways in which I think we could really do with going back towards that level of community action.
On which note, we have reached the end of this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity, Jamie and Harriet. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. Remember to tap follow. You can also, by the way, get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producers Ollie Peart and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.